Misperceived, an in-depth study of Percy Weasley's history, actions, and redemption as supported by theories of developmental psychology. My name is Alyssa D'Angelo, MS Ed. And a little bit about me before we get started. My pronouns are she, her. I'm 36 years old from Northeast Ohio in the United States. I am a former special education teacher, also known as an intervention specialist for American school-aged individuals with multiple and severe disabilities. I have a Master of Science in Accomplished Teaching from Temple University, right down the street from Chestnut Hill College. I do have background field experience in using studies of developmental psychology to formulate lessons, assessments, and progress monitoring for these American school-aged individuals. Currently, I'm not working in education. I am a healthcare worker. I am a certified nursing assistant, and I work with geriatrics as well as adults with developmental disabilities. So I'm still using some of that developmental psychology in my approach to how I work with my individuals. I do want to note before we get too far into this that this is a very rudimentary perspective of developmental psychology, specifically of John Bowlby's attachment theory and Albert Bandura's theories of modeling and behavior as they relate to the character of Percy Weasley. Though I do have education and experience in practical applications, I'm not a psychologist or a professor in any capacity. I want to start with some timelines and early background as they relate to Percy. Percy is a minor character, and he is mentioned 92 times in all 7 books. Yes, I counted. We know that he is the third child of Molly and Arthur and has 2 older brothers, 3 younger brothers, and a younger sister. We do know that the Weasley family is of low socioeconomic status, or in other words, live in poverty. At the time of Voldemort's initial defeat in the First Wizarding War between 1970 and 1981, Percy was 5 years old at the time of his defeat. Bill was 10, Charlie was 8, and it's notable that both were preparing for Hogwarts. Fred and George were 3, Ron was 1, and Ginny was all of 2 months old. Molly was in fact pregnant through almost the entire war and nearing the entirety of Percy's initial 5 years of life. A quick summary and continued timelines in the books, just as a refresher, because like we said, Percy is a C character, if you will. He's made a prefect in book 1 and he's very proud. In book 2, he's still a prefect, gets a girlfriend in Penelope Clearwater, and is constantly looking after an ill Ginny. In book 3, he's made head boy and herds the students around every time Sirius Black appears on the grounds, including when they all have to sleep in the Great Hall. In book 4, Percy, or as Crouch calls him, Weatherby, begins his career at the Ministry of Magic, junior assistant to Crouch. He also judges the second task in the Triwizard Tournament and is called in for questioning when it's revealed that the instructions from Crouch were really from an imposter. I do think it's also interesting to note that when the Dark Mark appeared at the Quidditch World Cup, Percy was helping the Ministry against the Death Eaters. Book 5 is when things start to go sideways, literally. Percy sides with the Ministry as an assistant to Fudge this time, despite that inquiry in book 4, as Voldemort makes his return against his family and the Order. It is suspected that because the Ministry has Percy, they want to spy on the Order through him, and he has a falling out with his family because of it. We're going to get a little bit more into that later. In book 6, Percy continues to work for the Ministry, this time as an assistant to Scrimgeour, and is still not really speaking with his family. I have a quote on that later. He goes to the Burrow on Christmas and is met with love from Molly, but contempt from his younger siblings, who in fact throws parsnips at him. In book 7, Percy, during the Battle of Hogwarts, arrives to help the Order, reunites with his family, fights alongside Fred. Floor's pious thickness, and later discourses broomstick regulations in the epilogue. So Percy is busy. He's got a constant changing character throughout these books. To get into more about Percy's childhood and those first few years of initial development, we have to talk about the First War. In Goblet of Fire, Sirius Black says in summary that the first time Voldemort rose to power, you don't know who he's working for or who's working for him and who isn't. You know that he can control people. You're scared for yourself, family, and friends. Every week there's more deaths, disappearances, and tortures. The ministry is in disarray. They don't know what to do. There's terror everywhere, panic, and confusion. This lets us know that this is Percy's reality from birth until age 5. Mad Eye has a picture of the original order in book 5. It doesn't show Molly or Arthur directly, but it does show Gideon and Fabian Pruitt, who are Molly's brothers. And it is noted that they both die in the war, which indicates that Percy had close family die in that war. And then in Deathly Hollows, it is officially introduced the concept of safe houses by name, and it's indicated that they were used in the First War in addition to the Second War. This information allows us to deduce that in Percy's most formidable years, with a constantly pregnant mother and being a middle child, younger than 2 promising aspiring wizards, and ultimately older than 3 toddlers and a newborn, all of which has been described as rambunctious, rowdy, mischievous, Percy lived with an outside environment full of panic, terror, and confusion. He was moved between safe houses and experienced death on a personal level. His family also lived in poverty before, during, and after these times. So that allows us to ask some essential questions. Are all these factors the reason why Percy is constantly and ambitiously looking for stability, consistency, routine, and structure? Is this why his personality is developed as so? And is this why he has difficulty maintaining relationships with his family in particular? So now we're going to get into the developmental psychology piece. As most of you know, I'm sure, developmental psychology is the branch of psychology that studies growth, change, and adaptations through the course of one's life. And there are multiple branches within developmental psychology: the physical, the cognitive, the emotional, the social, and the moral development. For the purposes of this presentation, we're going to focus on Percy's social and emotional development and then touch upon moral development as well. We're going to look at Bowlby's attachment theory. Bowlby's attachment theory states that the bond between an infant and their primary caregiver is a programmed need for survival and emotional development. This is providing a secure base from which a child can explore the world. It is claimed that there are 4 attachment styles, and they are developed within a child's first 2 years of life. There are also 4 phases of attachment development, and I've included some lovely graphics for easy understanding. I hope you guys can see them. I know the print is small. In the stages of attachment, there's the asocial, indiscriminate attachment, specific attachment, and multiple attachments. I know I went through that really fast. There's key features for each of them. I want to focus on that last stage of attachment for the purposes of this presentation in Percy, where there's multiple attachments for that child. It happens at 10 plus months old, so up through later childhood and into adult development. How a child bonds with other familiar individuals, not just a primary caregiver. As we know, Percy's primary caregiver was Molly, as well as Arthur, of course. But how he would also bond with siblings, grandparents, and other caregivers in his life. I also want to take a look at some attachment styles. There are 4 of them as well. 4 is kind of our magic number here with Bowlby. There is an anxious attachment style, avoidant, disorganized, which is also known as a fearful avoidant, and then secure. Percy falls mostly into the avoidant category, which includes traits such as persistently avoiding intimacy, feeling a strong sense of independence, being uncomfortable expressing feelings, and having a hard time trusting or commitment issues. So how does a child like Percy become avoidant, and how is it shown in these books? Bowlby states that a person can develop an avoidant personality by having caregivers that don't consistently provide a sense of security. And we can ask ourselves, how do you provide security in war, especially when you're moving from safe house to safe house? Consistently met with dismissiveness. Again, parents focused on war, preparing Bill and Charlie for Hogwarts, and managing mischievous twins, a 1-year-old, and a newborn. If we have any parents out there, as you know, the younger the child, the more attention they need. Being discouraged from crying, not that that's directly stated in the books, but Having to move between safe houses requires caution. And then Percy becoming potentially more frustrated or even possibly protective, such as with Ginny and Chamber of Secrets, but being frustrated with younger siblings striving to prove his intelligence over emotion. There's also adaptation and self-reliance to become overly independent, with Percy looking to find structure, success, and a way out of that low income status that we've mentioned. This is shown in the books as Percy having no real connection with his brothers due to that possible lack of structure. This also includes with Bill and Charlie, as described in early Goblet of Fire. They're setting up tables to have a large dinner with everybody that's present. Bill and Charlie are banging the tables together and like making them fight. And Percy sticks his head out the window and asks them to quiet down as he's working on his Cauldron Bottoms report. Later in Goblet of Fire, Percy sends a letter to Ron in which he has that hurried displeasure, trying to discuss about how he's getting information from Crouch in order to carry out his tasks. In Order of the Phoenix, he sends another level of disapproval with Ron's affiliation with Harry. Percy does not speak with his family in Order of the Phoenix and only briefly in Half-Blood Prince, and is met with disdain from everyone except Molly, who again is his primary caregiver. In the first 4 books, Percy focuses on his ambitions and career, sculpting his future from experience as prefect and head boy in order to continue to achieve his ultimate goals. And I do want to touch upon redemption as we discuss Bowlby. In what is speculated to be, in what is speculated to be an act of self-awareness, admission of wrongdoing, and an exercise in vulnerability, psychology suggests that Percy became fearful for his well-being of his family in the Second Growing War, sought forgiveness in these realizations, and his witnessing of Fred's death also caused a sort of epiphany. How does this happen and why does this matter? So Bowlby doesn't use the word trauma in his works, but trauma is a concept that applies to Percy's background and upbringing. In addition to his early childhood, Percy also experiences trauma in his final 3 years at Hogwarts as well, directly as his sister's taken into the chamber and his former pet rat is actually a traitor. This first year post Hogwarts puts an excessive amount of stress on Percy and all the doings of Crouch Sr. and the imposter Crouch Jr. He has to juggle becoming a judge for the second task, as well as his ministry work, and then his ultimate inquiry. He's only 18 years old when all of this is going on. He's still very young. This matters because Percy is an embodiment of how our relationships and experiences shape us, especially at young ages, and how even our mistakes and judgment can still alter and change. I have another theory I'd like to discuss here. An alternate theory is Albert Bandura's social learning theory. So social learning theory states that individuals can learn behaviors, attitudes, and emotional reactions through observations. In other words, individuals, mainly children, watch others with their behaviors and attitudes in their environment, observe how their behaviors are reinforced, and then model these behaviors and attitudes themselves. Motivation also plays a key component. There are 4 stages of learning that I have, again, attached a few little graphics for us to check out. The first one is the different factors that determine human behavior. There's cognitive factors, behavioral factors, and environmental factors. And then our 4 stages of learning include attention, retention, reproduction, and motivation. So how attention is given to, or how the displayed behavior is given, how it's observed and must be remembered, how the learner must reenact the behavior, and then a need for motivation to continue to reproduce the behavior. In order to make this make sense with Percy, we're going to look at family dynamics, peer influence, and workplace culture as they relate to Percy. For the 4 stages of learning, we're going to focus on early family dynamics. Attention stage, Percy's viewing Bill and Charlie as positive influences, and Fred and George is more chaotic. He's noticing the lack of new at home by receiving hand-me-downs and being unable to afford leisure items such as candy, their dilapidated home, etc. As far as retention, Percy retains how family reacts to Bill and Charlie's successes, sees that Fred, George, Ron, and Ginny require a lot more redirection or care in times of war. Reproduction, Percy begins to do as Bill and Charlie do, learning and performing well academically in the home setting. And for motivation, he's praised by family as well as at school, in hopes to either influence his young siblings to cooperate, to get away from some of that chaos, or to perform well enough to quickly get away from it. um, we like to ask ourselves, was Percy acknowledged for anything other than his academic performances? Was the expectation to perform as his older siblings did and to support and helping and protect his younger siblings during his first 5 years? This brings us into those personal, environmental, and behavioral factors with peer influence and workplace culture. Personally, Percy's witnessed the success of others in school and work and dedicates himself to his studies and career. Environmentally, Percy achieves success at school and work, thrives above his peers in a structured environment, and behaviorally, Percy is motivated to stay in an environment where he's continuously rewarded and not mocked by his younger siblings. And additionally, attempting to establish pride in the Weasley name, which is mentioned in Order of the Phoenix. Ron recounts that during an argument between Percy and Mr. Weasley, Percy states that he struggled against his father's lousy reputation and lack of ambition, and that's why the families had no money. After seeing the success of his brothers and other prefects and head boys in school, Percy and his avoidant personality are inclined to align himself with structured, successful career in order to escape or avoid continued chaos in the Second War and have pride in his name. Finally, we're going to bring back redemption. Through the lens of Bandura, Percy's redemption is merely a simple one. Harry asks Ron and Half-Blood Prince he's back on speaking terms with the rest of the Weasley family. When Ron says no, Hermione chimes in that Dumbledore says people find it hard to forgive others for being wrong than for being right, signifying that Percy knows that his family was right all along, but it's trying to forgive that's become difficult for him. It implies that Percy is still in the 4 stages of learning. However, Bandura states that learning can also result in a behavior change. This isn't always the case, but in Percy's situation, it is. It can be inferred that upon the Death Eater's takeover of the ministry, Percy was able to learn that the environment in which he'd worked so hard to thrive had changed. His recall of family dynamics, peer relations at Hogwarts allowed for him to align morally with the Order and fight against Voldemort. His love for his family, dysfunctional as they may be, was reignited. Finally, our conclusion. In summary, Percy's history as a middle child born into a large family of low socioeconomic status in a time of confusion, fear, and war is directly tied to his development of an avoidant personality, strained relationships with his family. His observations of those around him and the reinforcement of success in his later years caused a divide between himself and the rest of his family. However, through the recall of upbringing and awareness of the truth in a second war, Percy was able to forgive himself and his family, practice vulnerability, and exhibit a moral behavior change. Percy and his history and actions are especially complex, but his character arc shows us that we can change as people, we can redeem our actions, we can acknowledge our needs for improvement, and we can learn to embrace who we are, even with our difficult upbringings, challenges, and our trauma. Works slated, fan art credits, and just another thank you for everyone who's attended and listened to me talk about one of the most interesting characters in the series.